Following Cataclysm came the Mists of Pandaria expansion in 2012, which many players regard as the best expansion the game's ever had. It initially included only 8 dungeons, the fewest so far of any expansion. Blizzard had gone from 16 dungeons in the Burning Crusade to 14 in Wrath to 9 in Cataclysm, and now only 8 in the Mists of Pandaria. But instead of extending their formula that they had been using in previous expansions of including more bosses in fewer dungeons, we went from an average of 3 bosses per dungeon in the Burning Crusade to 4 in Wrath to 5 in Cataclysm, such that each expansion prior to Mists of Pandaria had included 45 or more dungeon bosses. Blizzard instead returned to an average of just over 3 bosses per dungeon in Mists like it was in the Burning Crusade, but with half the dungeons. As a result, Mists of Pandaria added only 20 new dungeon bosses to the game, less than half of what each previous expansion had added, the fewest of any expansion actually. A further 11 reused dungeon bosses were added when Scarlet Monastery was introduced with 6 and Scholomance with 5. So Mists had significantly fewer dungeons and fewer dungeon bosses than any other expansion, but it isn't really the whole story, because Mists of Pandaria added challenge modes to the game. In vanilla, dungeons didn't have a difficulty, they were just instances with a level range. In the Burning Crusade, heroic difficulty got added, which created max level versions of dungeons with higher level gear and difficulty so that dungeon content could become a much larger portion of player progression. Wrath then expanded that idea to raids by introducing heroic raids and splitting raid sizes to either 10 or 25 man. And challenge modes were the next iteration upon that sort of idea of varying dungeon and raid difficulties that started all the way back in the Burning Crusade with heroic dungeons. So it made sense for Blizzard to limit their workload overhead or exposure, so to speak, and to make dungeons more uniform with fewer bosses. So every dungeon added in Mists had 3 bosses in them except for Temple of the Jade Serpent and Shadowpan Monastery, which had 4. The size, length and scope of dungeons was also normalized so that each dungeon could be played almost like a slightly different piece or variation of a much more consistent and larger whole. On paper, Mists dungeon content was the smallest of all expansions to date, but in practice, Mists is where dungeons became a much larger facet of content and progression for players. It was the birth of the dungeon-only player as well, although they weren't very common yet. As for raiding content, Mists of Pandaria actually stacked up pretty well in this regard. It included 5 raids with 43 raid bosses within them, which actually places it pretty high on the kind of raiding content totem pole compared to other expansions. It equaled the 43 raid bosses launched the same as the Burning Crusade, and there's actually only one expansion that would release more raid bosses than that, which was Wrath of the Lich King with 45, only 2 more. And when talking about raids in just this dimension, like how many raids and how many raid bosses, it doesn't look like there's anything really amiss here. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what effectively became a mini content drought at the end of Mists of Pandaria. Because Mists, like every other WoW expansion, lasted for roughly 2 years, but almost all of the raiding content came out in the first, say, 8 to 9 months of the expansion. The Murgashan Vaults, the Heart of Fear, the Terrace of Endless Spring, the Throne of Thunder, it was all done far before we even got to the halfway point of Mists, which meant that the final raid, the Siege of Orgrimmar with 14 raid bosses, it was a large raid, but it was also the only real raiding content that we got at the end of Mists, and it lasted for 14 months. So while the expansion did quite well with the actual number of raids that were released and the bosses within them, it did a poor job of pacing that content. It front-loaded too much of it and then left only 1 raid for over half of the expansion. To editorialize a little here, the introduction of challenge mode dungeons was likely one of the best if not the single best decision Blizzard has made in World of Warcraft in the past 20 years, with the only other contenders being what was built upon challenge modes, Mythic Plus content. It birthed what would become one of the 3 main pillars of gameplay and progression for players for at least the following decade. It added flexibility and introduced endgame content for players who couldn't or wouldn't assume the commitments of a raiding schedule, which was often a dozen hours or more a week. Challenge modes were the first step of the dungeon roadmap, so to speak. It modernized World of Warcraft. But what made MOP such a great expansion is that it managed to do that, to modernize WoW, to introduce and lay the foundation of 5-man content going forward as a main avenue of progression. But it wasn't even really the best part of the expansion or what it is remembered for today. It's remembered as the expansion that first and foremost perfected a lot of class and spec design. It made combat rotations for a lot of specs make sense. It made them flow. And the Mists of Pandaria combat iteration for a lot of specs is still regarded as the peak for many of them. Mists also introduced a whole new class that was really nothing like what had come before, monks. It streamlined and modernized many aspects of the game. Now I say it did this, but it did this at the time because many of the systems that were implemented then have been made obsolete since. But at the time it introduced things like grand commendations for reputation factions. It added the championing system for reputations as well. It added things like the Green Fire quest for warlocks and the original metamorphosis, not the demon hunter kind, the old demon form. It also introduced the idea of what I guess we could now call almost mini expansions, the kind of the second dose of content that a lot of the later expansions would have, started or at least was properly formulated in Mists. The island idea that would come in later in expansions like the Timeless Isle and the Thundering Isle. Ironically, I don't think any WoW expansion has ever had such a poorly received reveal. People hated pandas when the initial trailer was released, and it was quite a common sentiment that Blizzard were releasing or making Mists of Pandaria to pander to their Chinese audience. People hated the idea of another self-contained continent expansion with a faction war. They hated the idea of monks and their silly kung fu. Mists of Pandaria, at least the initial reception, was absolutely horrible, even though the expansion itself really wasn't. If only someone had told us that we were in the good old days at the time, because we were about to head into the Warlords of Draenor expansion and the what is now infamous content drought, its single player garrisons, and many of the things that were added in Warlords of Draenor that weren't seen as good additions to the game. I don't think it's too hyperbolic to say that by the end of Mists of Pandaria, we as a player base were transitioning from the best expansion World of Warcraft's ever had into the worst with Warlords of Draenor. But that discussion is for the next video. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and algorithm stuff.